Section 0 of The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Part 1. Preface and Introduction. Preface. The object of this work has been from historical data to show that the Southern States had rightfully the power to withdraw from a union into which they had, as sovereign communities, voluntarily entered; that the denial of that right was a violation of the letter and spirit of the compact between the States; and that the war waged by the Federal Government against the seceding States was in disregard of the limitations of the constitutions, and destructive of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The author, from his official position, may claim to have known much of the motive and acts of his countrymen immediately before and during the War of 1861 1865, and he has sought to furnish material for the future historian, who, when the passions and prejudices of the day shall have given place to reason and sober thought, may, better than a contemporary, investigate the causes, conduct, and results of the war. The incentive to undertake the work now offered to the public was the desire to correct misapprehensions created by industrially circulated misrepresentations as to the acts and purposes of the people and the general government of the Confederate States. By the reiteration of such unappropriate terms as rebellion and treason, and the asseveration that the South was levying war against the United States, those ignorant of the nature of the Union and of the reserved power of the States have been led to believe that the Confederate States were in the condition of revolted provinces, and that the United States were forced to resort to arms for the preservation of their existence. To those who knew that the Union was formed for specific enumerated purposes, and that the States had never surrendered their sovereignty, it was a palpable absurdity to apply to them, or to their citizens when obeying their mandates, the terms rebellion and treason; and, further, it is shown in the following pages that the Confederate States, so far from making war or seeking to destroy the United States, as soon as they had an official organ, strove earnestly, by peaceful recognition, to equitably adjust all questions growing out of the separation from their late associates. Another great perversion of truth has been the arraignment of the men who participated in the formation of the Confederacy and who bore arms in its defense, as the instigators of a controversy leading to disunion. Sectional issues appear conspicuously in the debates of the convention which framed the Federal Constitution, and its many compromises were designed to secure an equilibrium between the sections, and to preserve the interests as well as the liberty of the several States. African servitude at that time was not confined to a section, but was numerically greater in the South than in the North, with a tendency to its continuance in the former and a cessation in the latter. It therefore thus early presents itself as a disturbing element, and the provisions of the Constitution, which were known to be necessary for its adoption, bound all the States to recognize and protect that species of property. When, at a subsequent period, there arose in the Northern States an anti-slavery agitation, it was a harmless and scarcely noticed movement until political demagogues seized upon it as a means to acquire power. Had it been left to pseudo-philanthropists and fanatics, most zealous where least informed, it never could have shaken the foundations of the Union and have incited one section to carry fire and sword into the other. That the agitation was political in its character, and was clearly developed as early as 1803, it is believed has been established in these pages. To preserve a sectional equilibrium, and to maintain the equality of the States was the effort on one side; to acquire empire was the manifest purpose on the other. This struggle began before the men of the Confederacy were born. How it arose and how it progressed it has been attempted briefly to show. Its last stage was on the question of territorial governments, and, if in this work it has not been demonstrated that the position of the South was justified by the Constitution and the equal rights of the people of all the States, it must be because the author has failed to present the subject with a sufficient degree of force and clearness. In describing the events of the war, space has not permitted, and the loss of both books and papers has prevented, the notice of very many entitled to consideration, as well for the humanity as the gallantry of our men in the unequal combats they fought. These numerous omissions, it is satisfactory to know, the official reports made at the time and the subsequent contributions which have been and are being published by the actors will supply more fully and graphically than could have been done in this work. Usurpations of the Federal Government have been presented, not in a spirit of hostility, but as a warning to the people against the dangers by which their liberties are beset. When the war ceased, the pretext on which it had been waged could no longer be alleged. The Emancipation Proclamation of Mr. Lincoln, which, when it was issued, he humorously admitted to be a nullity, had acquired validity by the action of the highest authority known to our institutions, the people assembled in their several State conventions. The soldiers of the Confederacy had laid down their arms, had in good faith pledged themselves to abstain from further hostile operations, and had peacefully dispersed to their homes. There could not then have been further dread of them by the government of the United States. The plea of necessity could, therefore, no longer exist for hostile demonstration against the people and States of the deceased Confederacy. Did vengeance, which stops at the grave, subside? Did real peace and the restoration of the States to their former rights and positions follow, as was promised on the restoration of the Union? Let the recital of the invasion of the reserved powers of the States, or the people, and the perversion of the republican form of government guaranteed to each State by the Constitution, answer the question. For the deplorable fact of the war, for the cruel manner in which it was waged, for the sad physical and yet sadder moral results it produced, the reader of these pages, I hope, will admit that the South, in the forum of conscience, stands fully acquitted. Much of the past is irremediable. The best hope for a restoration in the future to the pristine purity and fraternity of the Union rests on the opinion and character of the men who are to succeed this generation. That they may be suited to that blessed work, one, whose public course is ended, invokes them to draw their creed from the fountains of our political history, rather than from the lower stream, polluted as it has been by self-seeking place-hunters and by sectional strife. The Author. Introduction. A duty to my countrymen, to the memory of those who died in defense of a cause consecrated by inheritance, as well as sustained by conviction, and to those who, perhaps less fortunate, staked all, and lost all, save life and honor, in its behalf, has impelled me to attempt the vindication of their cause and conduct. For this purpose I have decided to present an historical sketch of the events which preceded and attended the struggle of the Southern States to maintain their existence and their rights as sovereign communities, the creators, not the creatures, of the general government. The social problem of maintaining the just relation between Constitution, government, and people has been found so difficult that human history is a record of unsuccessful efforts to establish it. A government, to afford the needful protection and exercise proper care for the welfare of a people, must have homogeneity in its constituents. It is this necessity which has divided the human race into separate nations, and finally has defeated the grandest efforts which conquerors have made to give unlimited extent to their domain. When our fathers dissolved their connection with Great Britain, by declaring themselves free and independent states, they constituted 13 separate communities, and were careful to assert and preserve, each for itself, its sovereignty and jurisdiction. At a time when the minds of men are straying far from the lessons our fathers taught, it seems proper and well to recur to the original principles on which the system of government they devised was founded. The eternal truths which they announced, the rights which they declared unalienable, are the foundation stones on which rests the vindication of the Confederate cause. He must have been a careless reader of our political history who has not observed that, whether under the style of United Colonies or United States, which was adopted after the Declaration of Independence, whether under the Articles of Confederation or the Compact of Union, there everywhere appears the distinct assertion of State sovereignty, and nowhere the slightest suggestion of any purpose on the part of the States to consolidate themselves into one body. Will any candid, well-informed man assert that, at any time between 1776 and 1790, a proposition to surrender the sovereignty of the States and merge them in a central government would have had the least possible chance of adoption? Can any historical fact be more demonstrable than that the States did, both in the Confederation and in the Union, retain their sovereignty and independence as distinct communities, voluntarily consenting to federation, but never becoming the fractional parts of a nation? That such opinion should find adherents in our day may be attributable to the natural law of aggregation, surely not to a conscientious regard for the terms of the compact for union by the States. In all free governments the Constitution, or organic law, is supreme over the government, and in our Federal Union this was most distinctly marked by limitations and prohibitions against all which was beyond the expressed grants of power to the general government. In the foreground, therefore, I take the position that those who resisted violations of the compact were the true friends, and those who maintained the usurpation of undelegated powers were the real enemies of the constitutional union. End of Preface and Introduction. Recording by Robert Hoffman. Of the Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Part 1, Chapter 1. African Servitude. A Retrospect. Early legislation with regard to the slave trade. The Southern States foremost in prohibiting it. A common error corrected. The ethical question never at issue in sectional controversies. The acquisition of Louisiana. The Missouri Compromise. The balance of power. Note: the Indiana case. Inasmuch as questions growing out of the institution of negro servitude, or connected with it, will occupy a conspicuous place in what is to follow, it is important that the reader should have, in the very outset, a right understanding of the true nature and character of those questions. No subject has been more generally misunderstood or more persistently misrepresented. The institution itself has ceased to exist in the United States. The generation, comprising all who took part in the controversies to which it gave rise, or for which it afforded a pretext, is passing away, and the misconceptions which have prevailed in our country, and still more among foreigners remote from the field of contention, are likely to be perpetuated in the mind of posterity unless corrected before they become crystallized by tacit acquiescence. It is well known that, at the time of the adoption of the Federal Constitution, African servitude existed in all the States that were parties to that compact, unless with the single exception of Massachusetts, in which it had, perhaps, very recently ceased to exist. The slaves, however, were numerous in the Southern and very few in the Northern States. This diversity was occasioned by differences of climate, soil, and industrial interests, not in any degree by moral considerations, which at that period were not recognized as an element in the question. It was simply because negro labor was more profitable in the South than in the North that the importation of negro slaves had been, and continued to be, chiefly directed to the Southern ports. Footnote: it will be remembered that, during her colonial condition, Virginia made strenuous efforts to prevent the importation of Africans, and was overruled by the Crown. Also that Georgia, under Oglethorpe, did prohibit the introduction of African slaves until 1752, when the proprietors surrendered the charter, and the colony became a part of the royal government, and enjoyed the same privileges as the other colonies. End of footnote. For the same reason slavery was abolished by the states of the northern section, though it existed in several of them for more than 50 years after the adoption of the Constitution, while the importation of slaves into the South continued to be carried on by northern merchants and northern ships, without interference in the traffic from any quarter, until it was prohibited by the spontaneous action of the Southern states themselves. The Constitution expressly forbade any interference by Congress with the slave trade, or, to use its own language, with the "migration or importation of such persons" as any of the states should think proper to admit, prior to the year 1808. During the intervening period of more than 20 years, the matter was exclusively under the control of the respective states. Nevertheless, every Southern state, without exception, either had already enacted, or proceeded to enact, laws forbidding the importation of slaves. Footnote. South Carolina subsequently, in 1803, repealed her law forbidding the importation of slaves. The reason assigned for this action was the impossibility of enforcing the law without the aid of the federal government, to which entire control of the revenues, revenue police, and naval forces of the country had been surrendered by the states. "The geographical situation of our country," said Mr. Lowndes, of South Carolina, in the House of Representatives on February 14, 1804, "is not unknown. With navigable rivers running into the heart of it, it was impossible, with our means, to prevent our Eastern brethren, engaged in this trade, from introducing them (the negroes) into the country. The law was completely evaded. Under these circumstances, sir, it appears to me to have been the duty of the legislature to repeal the law, and remove from the eyes of the people the spectacle of its authority being daily violated." The effect of the repeal was to permit the importation of negroes into South Carolina during the interval from 1803 to 1808. It is probable that an extensive contraband trade was carried on by the New England slavers with other ports, on account of the lack of means to enforce the laws of the Southern states forbidding it. End of footnote. Virginia was the first of all the states, North or South, to prohibit it, and Georgia was the first to incorporate such a prohibition in her organic constitution. 2 petitions for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade were presented February 11th and 12th, 1790, to the very first Congress convened under the Constitution. Footnote. One from the Society of Friends assembled at Philadelphia and New York, the other from the Pennsylvania Society of various religious denominations combined for the abolition of slavery. End of footnote. After full discussion in the House of Representatives, it was determined, with regard to the first mentioned subject, "that Congress have no authority to interfere in the emancipation of slaves, or in the treatment of them within any of the States," and, with regard to the other, that no authority existed to prohibit the migration or importation of such persons as the States might think proper to admit, prior to the year 1808. So distinct and final was this statement of the limitations of the authority of Congress considered to be that, when a similar petition was presented 2 or 3 years afterward, the clerk of the House was instructed to return it to the petitioner. In 1807, Congress, availing itself of the very earliest moment at which the constitutional restriction ceased to be operative, passed an act prohibiting the importation of slaves into any part of the United States from and after the 1st day of January, 1808. This act was passed with great unanimity. In the House of Representatives there were 113 yeas to 5 nays, and it is a significant fact, as showing the absence of any sectional division of sentiment at that period, that the 5 dissentients were divided as equally as possible between the 2 sections. 2 of them were from Northern and 3 from Southern States. Footnote. One was from New Hampshire, 1 from Vermont, 2 from Virginia, and 1 from South Carolina. End of footnote. The slave trade had thus been finally abolished some months before the birth of the author of these pages, and has never since had legal existence in any of the United States. The question of the maintenance or extinction of the system of negro servitude already existing in any state was one exclusively belonging to such state. It is obvious, therefore, that no subsequent question, legitimately arising in federal legislation, could properly have any reference to the merits or the policy of the institution itself. A few zealots in the North afterward created much agitation by demands for the abolition of slavery within the States by federal intervention, and by their activity and perseverance finally became a recognized party, which, holding the balance of power between the two contending organizations in that section, gradually obtained the control of one, and to no small degree corrupted the other. The dominant idea, however, at least of the absorbed party, was sectional aggrandizement, looking to absolute control, and theirs is the responsibility for the war that resulted. No moral nor sentimental considerations were really involved in either the earlier or later controversies which so long agitated and finally ruptured the Union. They were simply struggles between different sections, with diverse institutions and interests. It is absolutely requisite, in order to a right understanding of the history of the country, to bear these truths clearly in mind. The phraseology of the period referred to will otherwise be essentially deceptive. The antithetical employment of such terms as freedom and slavery, or anti-slavery and pro-slavery, with reference to the principles and purposes of contending parties or rival sections, has had immense influence in misleading the opinions and sympathies of the world. The idea of freedom is captivating, that of slavery repellent to the moral sense of mankind in general. It is easy, therefore, to understand the effect of applying the one set of terms to one party, the other to another, in a contest which had no just application whatever to the essential merits of freedom or slavery. Southern statesmen may perhaps have been too indifferent to this consideration in their ardent pursuit of principles, overlooking the effect of phrases. This is especially true with regard to that familiar but most fallacious expression, "the extension of slavery." To the reader unfamiliar with the subject, or viewing it only on the surface, it would perhaps never occur that, as used in the great controversies respecting the territories of the United States, it does not, never did, and never could imply the addition of a single slave to the number already existing. The question was merely whether the slaveholder should be permitted to go, with his slaves, into territory, the common property of all, into which the non-slaveholder could go with his property of any sort. There was no proposal nor desire on the part of the Southern States to reopen the slave trade, which they had been foremost in suppressing, or to add to the number of slaves. It was a question of the distribution or dispersion of the slaves rather than of the extension of slavery. Removal is not extension. Indeed, if emancipation was the end to be desired, the dispersion of the negroes over a wider area among the additional territories, eventually to become states, and in climates unfavorable to slave labor, instead of hindering, would have promoted this object by diminishing the difficulties in the way of ultimate emancipation. The distinction here defined between the distribution or dispersion of slaves and the extension of slavery, two things altogether different, although so generally confounded, was early and clearly drawn under circumstances and in a connection which justify a fuller notice. Virginia, it is well known, in the year 1784, ceded to the United States, then united only by the original Articles of Confederation. Her vast possessions northwest of the Ohio, from which the great states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, have since been formed. In 1787, before the adoption of the Federal Constitution, The celebrated ordinance for the government of this Northwestern Territory was adopted by the Congress, with the full consent, and indeed at the express instance of Virginia. This ordinance included 6 definite articles of compact between the original States and the people and States in the said Territory, which were to "forever remain unalterable unless by common consent." The 6th of these articles ordains that "there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said Territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted." In December, 1805, a petition of the Legislative Council and House of Representatives of the Indiana Territory, then comprising all the area now occupied by the States of Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, was presented to Congress. It appears from the proceedings of the House of Representatives that several petitions of the same purport from inhabitants of the Territory, accompanied by a letter from William Henry Harrison, the governor, afterward President of the United States, had been under consideration nearly 2 years earlier. The prayer of these petitions was for a suspension of the 6th article of the ordinance, so as to permit the introduction of slaves into the Territory. The whole subject was referred to a select committee of 7 members, consisting of representatives from Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Kentucky, and New York, and the delegate from the Indiana Territory. On the 14th of the ensuing February, 1806, this committee made a report favorable to the prayer of the petitioners, and recommending a suspension of the prohibitory article for 10 years. In their report, the committee, after stating their opinion that a qualified suspension of the article in question would be beneficial to the people of the Indiana Territory, proceeded to say, "The suspension of this article is an object almost universally desired in that Territory. It appears to your committee to be a question entirely different from that between slavery and freedom, inasmuch as it would merely occasion the removal of persons, already slaves, from one part of the country to another. The good effects of this suspension, in the present instance, would be to accelerate the population of that Territory, hitherto retarded by the operation of that article of compact. As slaveholders emigrating into the Western country might then indulge any preference which they might feel for a settlement in the Indiana Territory, instead of seeking, as they are now compelled to do, settlements in other States or countries permitting the introduction of slaves. The condition of the slaves themselves would be much ameliorated by it, as it is evident, from experience, that the more they are separated and diffused the more care and attention are bestowed on them by their masters, each proprietor having it in his power to increase their comforts and conveniences in proportion to the smallness of their numbers." These were the dispassionate utterances of representatives of every part of the Union, men contemporary with the origin of the Constitution, speaking before any sectional division had arisen in connection with the subject. It is remarkable that the very same opinions which they express, and arguments which they adduce had, 50 years afterward, come to be denounced and repudiated by one half of the Union as partisan and sectional when propounded by the other half. No final action seems to have been taken on the subject before the adjournment of Congress, but it was brought forward at the next session in a more imposing form. On the 20th of January, 1807, the Speaker laid before the House of Representatives a letter from Governor Harrison, enclosing certain resolutions formally and unanimously adopted by the Legislative Council and House of Representatives of the Indiana Territory, in favor of the suspension of the 6th article of the ordinance and the introduction of slaves into the Territory, which they say would "meet the approbation of at least 9/10 of the good citizens of the same." Among the resolutions were the following: Resolved unanimously, that the abstract question of liberty and slavery is not considered as involved in a suspension of the said article, inasmuch as the number of slaves in the United States would not be augmented by this measure. Resolved unanimously,
that the suspension of the said article would be equally advantageous to the territory,
to the States from whence the negroes would be brought,
and to the negroes themselves. The States which are overburdened with negroes would be benefited by their citizens having an opportunity of disposing of the negroes which they cannot comfortably support,
or of removing with them to a country abounding with all the necessaries of life.
and the negro himself would exchange a scanty pittance of the coarsest food for a plentiful and nourishing diet, and a situation which admits not the most distant prospect of emancipation for one which presents no considerable obstacle to his wishes." Unquote.
These resolutions were submitted to a committee drawn, like the former,
from different sections of the country, which again reported favorably, reiterating in substance the reasons given by the former committee. Their report was sustained by the House, and a resolution to suspend the prohibitory article was adopted. The proposition failed, however, in the Senate, and there the matter seems to have been dropped. The proceedings constitute a significant and instructive episode in the political history of the country. The allusion which has been made to the ordinance of 1787 renders it proper to notice, very briefly, the argument put forward during the discussion of the Missouri question, and often repeated since, that the ordinance afforded a precedent in support of the claim of a power in Congress to determine the question of the admission of slaves into the territories, and in justification of the prohibitory clause applied in 1820 to a portion of the Louisiana Territory. The difference between the Congress of the Confederation and that of the Federal Constitution is so broad that the action of the former can, in no just sense, be taken as a precedent for the latter. The Congress of the Confederation represented the States in their sovereignty, each delegation having one vote, so that all States were of equal weight in the decision of any question. It had legislative, executive, and in some degree judicial powers, thus combining all departments of government in itself. During its recess, a committee known as the Committee of the States exercised the powers of the Congress, which was in spirit, if not in fact, an assemblage of the States. On the other hand, the Congress of the Constitution is only the legislative department of the general government, with powers strictly defined and expressly limited to those delegated by the States. It is further held in check by an executive and a judiciary, and consists of two branches, each having peculiar and specified functions. If then it be admitted, which is at least very questionable, that the Congress of the Confederation had rightfully the power to exclude slave property from the territory northwest of the Ohio River, that power must have been derived from its character as an assemblage of the sovereign States, not from the Articles of Confederation, in which no indication of the grant of authority to exercise such a function can be found. The Congress of the Constitution is expressly prohibited from the assumption of any power not distinctly and specifically delegated to it as the legislative branch of an organized government. What was questionable in the former case, therefore, becomes clearly inadmissible in the latter. But there is yet another material distinction to be observed. The States, owners of what was called the Northwestern Territory, were component members of the Congress which adopted the ordinance for its government, and gave thereto their full and free consent. The ordinance may, therefore, be regarded as virtually a treaty between the States which ceded and those which received that extensive domain. In the other case, Missouri and the whole region affected by the Missouri Compromise were parts of the territory acquired from France under the name of Louisiana, and, as it requires two parties to make or amend a treaty, France and the government of the United States should have cooperated in any amendment of the treaty by which Louisiana had been acquired, and which guaranteed to the inhabitants of the ceded territory "all the rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens of the United States," and "the free enjoyment of their liberty, property, and the religion they profess." State Papers, Volume 2, Foreign Relations, page 507. For all the reasons thus stated, it seems to me conclusive that the action of the Congress of the Confederation in 1787 could not constitute a precedent to justify the action of the Congress of the United States in 1820, and that the prohibitory clause of the Missouri Compromise was without constitutional authority, in violation of the rights of a part of the joint owners of the territory, and in disregard of the obligations of the treaty with France. The basis of sectional controversy was the question of the balance of political power. In its earlier manifestations this was undisguised. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803, and the subsequent admission of a portion of that territory into the Union as a state, afforded one of the earliest occasions for the manifestation of sectional jealousy, and gave rise to the first threats or warnings, which proceeded from New England, of a dissolution of the Union. Yet, although negro slavery existed in Louisiana, no pretext was made of that as an objection to the acquisition. The ground of opposition is frankly stated in a letter of that period from one Massachusetts statesman to another, "that the influence of our part of the Union must be diminished by the acquisition of more weight at the other extremity." Footnote: Cabot to Pickering, who was then senator from Massachusetts. Some years afterward, in 1819 20, occurred the memorable contest with regard to the admission into the Union of Missouri, the second state carved out of the Louisiana Territory. The controversy arose out of a proposition to attach to the admission of the new state a proviso prohibiting slavery or involuntary servitude therein. The vehement discussion that ensued was continued into the first session of a different Congress from that in which it originated, and agitated the whole country during the interval between the two. It was the first question that ever seriously threatened the stability of the Union, and the first in which the sentiment of opposition to slavery in the abstract was introduced as an adjunct of sectional controversy. It was clearly shown in debate that such considerations were altogether irrelevant, that the number of existing slaves would not be affected by their removal from the older states to Missouri, and, moreover, that the proposed restriction would be contrary to the spirit, if not to the letter, of the Constitution. Footnote: The true issue was well stated by the Hon. Samuel A. Foote, a representative from Connecticut, in an incidental reference to it in debate on another subject, a few weeks after the final settlement of the Missouri case. He said, "The Missouri question did not involve the question of freedom or slavery, but merely whether slaves now in the country might be permitted to reside in the proposed new state, and whether Congress or Missouri possessed the power to decide." Notwithstanding all this, the restriction was adopted, by a vote almost strictly sectional, in the House of Representatives. It failed in the Senate through the firm resistance of the Southern, aided by a few patriotic and conservative Northern members of that body. The admission of the new state, without any restriction, was finally accomplished by the addition to the bill of a section forever prohibiting slavery in all that portion of the Louisiana Territory lying north of 36 degrees and 30 minutes north latitude, except Missouri, by implication leaving the portions south of that line open to settlement either with or without slaves. This provision, as an offset to the admission of the new state without restriction, constituted the celebrated Missouri Compromise. It was reluctantly accepted by a small majority of the Southern members. Nearly half of them voted against it, under the conviction that it was unauthorized by the Constitution, and that Missouri was entitled to determine the question for herself, as a matter of right, not of bargain or concession. Among those who thus thought and voted were some of the wisest statesmen and purest patriots of that period. Footnote: The votes on the proposed restriction, which eventually failed of adoption, and on the compromise, which was finally adopted, are often confounded. The advocacy of the former measure was exclusively sectional, no Southern member voting for it in either house. On the adoption of the compromise line of 36 degrees and 30 minutes, the vote in the Senate was 34 yeas to 10 nays. The Senate consisted of 44 members from 22 states, equally divided between the two sections, Delaware being classed as a Southern state. Among the yeas were all the Northern votes, except 2 from Indiana, being 20, and 14 Southern. The nays consisted of 2 from the North and 8 from the South. In the House of Representatives, the vote was 134 yeas to 42 nays. Of the yeas, 95 were Northern, 39 Southern; of the nays, 5 Northern and 37 Southern. Among the nays in the Senate were Messrs. James Barbour and James Pleasants of Virginia, Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina, John Gilliard and William Smith of South Carolina. In the House, Philip P. Barbour, John Randolph, John Tyler, and William S. Archer of Virginia, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, one of the authors of the Constitution, Thomas W. Cobb of Georgia, and others of more or less note. This brief retrospect may have sufficed to show that the question of the right or wrong of the institution of slavery was in no wise involved in the earlier sectional controversies, nor was it otherwise in those of a later period, in which it was the lot of the author of these memoirs to bear a part. They were essentially struggles for sectional equality or ascendancy,
for the maintenance or the destruction of that balance of power or equipoise between North and South, which was early recognized as a cardinal principle in our federal system. It does not follow that both parties to this contest were wholly right or wholly wrong in their claims. The determination of the question of right or wrong must be left to the candid inquirer after examination of evidence. The object of these preliminary investigations has been to clear the subject of the obscurity produced by irrelevant issues and the glamour of ethical illusions. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Robert Hoffman. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Part 1, Chapter 2. The Session of 1849 and 1850, the Compromise Measures, Virtual Abrogation of the Missouri Compromise, the Admission of California, the Fugitive Slave Law, Death of Mr. Calhoun, Antidote of Mr. Clay. The first session of the 31st Congress, 1849 and 1850, was a memorable one. The recent acquisition from Mexico of New Mexico and California required legislation by Congress. In the Senate the bills reported by the Committee on Territories were referred to a select committee, of which Mr. Clay, the distinguished senator from Kentucky, was chairman. From this committee emanated the bills which, taken together, are known as the Compromise Measures of 1850. With some others, I advocated the division of the newly acquired territory by an extension to the Pacific Ocean of the Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees and 30 minutes north latitude. This was not because of any inherent merit or fitness in that line, but because it had been accepted by the country as a settlement of the sectional question which, 30 years before, had threatened a rupture of the Union, and it had acquired in the public mind a prescriptive respect which it seemed unwise to disregard. A majority, however, decided otherwise, and the line of political conciliation was then obliterated, as far as it lay in the power of Congress to do so. An analysis of the vote will show that this result was effected almost exclusively by the representatives of the North, and that the South was not responsible for an action which proved to be the opening of Pandora's box. Footnote: The vote in the Senate on the proposition to continue the line of the Missouri Compromise through the newly acquired territory to the Pacific was 24 yeas to 32 nays. Reckoning Delaware and Missouri as Southern States, the vote of the two sections was exactly equal. The yeas were all cast by Southern senators, the nays were all Northern, except 2 from Delaware, 1 from Missouri, and 1 from Kentucky. End of footnote. However objectionable it may have been in 1820 to adopt that political line as expressing a geographical definition of different sectional interests, and however it may be condemned as the assumption by Congress of a function not delegated to it, it is to be remembered that the act had received such recognition and quasi-ratification by the people of the States as to give it a value which it did not originally possess. Pacification had been the fruit borne by the tree, and it should not have been recklessly hewed down and cast into the fire. The frequent assertion then made was that all discrimination was unjust, and that the popular will should be left untrammeled in the formation of new States. The theory was good enough in itself, and as an abstract proposition could not be gainsaid, but its practical operation has but poorly sustained the expectation of its advocates, as will be seen when we come to consider the events that occurred a few years later in Kansas and elsewhere. Retrospectively viewed under the mellowing light of time, and with the calm consideration we can usually give to the irremediable past, the compromise legislation of 1850 bears the impress of that sectional spirit so widely at variance with the general purposes of the Union, and so destructive of the harmony and mutual benefit which the Constitution was intended to secure. The refusal to divide the territory acquired from Mexico by an extension of the line of the Missouri Compromise to the Pacific was a consequence of the purpose to admit California as a State of the Union before it had acquired the requisite population, and while it was mainly under the control of a military organization sent from New York during the war with Mexico and disbanded in California upon the restoration of peace. The inconsistency of the argument against the extension of the line was exhibited in the division of the territory of Texas by that parallel, and payment to the State of money to secure her consent to the partition of her domain. In the case of Texas, the North had everything to gain and nothing to lose by the application of the practice of geographical compromise on the arbitrary line. In the case of California, the conditions were reversed. The South might have been the gainer and the North the loser by a recognition of the same rule. The compensation which it was alleged that the South received was a more effective law for the rendition of fugitives from service or labor. But it is to be remarked that this law provided for the execution by the general government of obligations which had been imposed by the federal compact upon the several States of the Union. The benefit to be derived from a fulfillment of that law would be small in comparison with the evil to result from the plausible pretext that the States had thus been relieved from a duty which they had assumed in the adoption of the compact of union. Whatever tended to lead the people of any of the States to feel that they could be relieved from their constitutional obligations by transferring them to the general government, or that they might thus or otherwise evade or resist them, could not fail to be like the tares which the enemy sowed amid the wheat. The Union of States, formed to secure the permanent welfare of posterity and to promote harmony among the constituent States, could not, without changing its character, survive such alienation as rendered its parts hostile to the security, prosperity, and happiness of one another. It was reasonably argued that, as the legislatures of 14 of the States had enacted what were termed "personal liberty laws," which forbade the cooperation of State officials in the rendition of fugitives from service and labor, it became necessary that the general government should provide the requisite machinery for the execution of the law. The result proved what might have been anticipated, that those communities which had repudiated their constitutional obligations, which had nullified a previous law of Congress for the execution of a provision of the Constitution, and had murdered men who came peacefully to recover their property, would evade or obstruct, so as to render practically worthless, any law that could be enacted for that purpose. In the exceptional cases in which it might be executed, the event would be attended with such conflict between State and Federal authorities as to produce consequent evils greater than those it was intended to correct. It was during the progress of these memorable controversies that the South lost its most trusted leader, and the Senate its greatest and purest statesman. He was taken from us, "like a summer-dried fountain when our need was the sorest." When his intellectual power, his administrative talent,
his love of peace, and his devotion to the Constitution, might have averted collision, or, failing in that, he might have been to the south the Palinurus to steer the bark in safety over the perilous sea. Truly did Mr. Webster, his personal friend, although his greatest political rival, say of him in his obituary address, "There was nothing groveling, or low, or meanly selfish, that came near the head or the heart of Mr. Calhoun." His prophetic warnings speak from the grave with the wisdom of inspiration. Would that they could have been appreciated by his countrymen while he yet lived! Note: While the compromise measures of 1850 were pending, and the excitement concerning them was at its highest, I one day overtook Mr. Clay of Kentucky and Mr. Berrien of Georgia in the Capitol grounds. They were in earnest conversation. It was the 7th of March, the day on which Mr. Webster had delivered his great speech. Mr. Clay, addressing me in the friendly manner which he had always employed since I was a schoolboy in Lexington, asked me what I thought of the speech. I liked it better than he did. He then suggested that I should "join the compromise men," saying that it was a measure which he thought would probably give peace to the country for 30 years, the period that had elapsed since the adoption of the Compromise of 1820. Then, turning to Mr. Berrien, he said, "You and I will be under ground before that time, but our young friend here may have trouble to meet." I somewhat impatiently declared my unwillingness to transfer to posterity a trial which they would be relatively less able to meet than we were, and passed on my way. CHAPTER III.
Of The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Moseley. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Part 1, Chapter 3. Re-election to the Senate. Public controversies in Mississippi. Action of the Democratic State Convention. Defeat of the State Rights Party. Withdrawal of General Quitman and nomination of the author as candidate for the office of governor. The canvass and its result. Retirement to private life. I had been re-elected by the legislature of Mississippi as my own successor, and entered upon a new term of service in the Senate on March 4th, 1851. On my return to Mississippi in 1851, the subject chiefly agitating the public mind was that of the compromise measures of the previous year. Consequent upon these was a proposition for a convention of delegates from the people of the Southern States respectively, to consider what steps ought to be taken for their future peace and safety, and the preservation of their constitutional rights. There was diversity of opinion with regard to the merits of the measures referred to, but the disagreement no longer followed the usual lines of party division. They who saw in those measures the forerunner of disaster to the South had no settled policy beyond a convention, the object of which should be to devise new and more effectual guarantees against the perils of usurpation. They were unjustly charged with the desire to destroy the Union, a feeling entertained by few, very few, if by any, in Mississippi, and avowed by none. There were many, however, who held that the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the purposes for which the Union was formed were of higher value than the mere Union itself. Independence existed before the compact of union between the States, and if that compact should be broken in part, and therefore destroyed in whole, it was hoped that the liberties of the people in the States might still be preserved. Those who were most devoted to the Union of the Constitution might, consequently, be expected to resist most sternly any usurpation of undelegated power, the effect of which would be to warp the federal government from its proper character, and by sapping the foundation, to destroy the Union of the States. My recent reelection to the United States Senate had conferred upon me for 6 years longer the office which I preferred to all others. I could not therefore be suspected of desiring a nomination for any other office from the Democratic Convention, the meeting of which was then drawing near. Having, as a senator of the State, freely participated in debate on the measures which were now exciting so much interest in the public mind, it was very proper that I should visit the people in different parts of the State and render an account of my stewardship. My devotion to the Union of our fathers had been so often and so publicly declared, I had, on the floor of the Senate, so defiantly challenged any question of my fidelity to it, my services, civil and military, had now extended through so long a period, and were so generally known, that I felt quite assured that no whisperings of envy or ill will could lead the people of Mississippi to believe that I had dishonored their trust by using the power they had conferred on me to destroy the government to which I was accredited. Then, as afterward, I regarded the separation of the States as a great, though not the greatest, evil. I returned from my tour among the people at the time appointed for the meeting of the nominating convention of the Democratic, or State Rights, party. During the previous year, the governor, General John A. Quitman, had been compelled to resign his office to answer an indictment against him for complicity with the filibustering expeditions against Cuba. The charges were not sustained. Many of the Democratic party of Mississippi, myself included, recognized a consequent obligation to renominate him for the office of which he had been deprived. When, however, the delegates met in party convention, the committee appointed to select candidates, on comparison of opinions, concluded that, in view of the effort to fix upon the party the imputation of a purpose of disunion, some of the antecedents of General Quitman might endanger success. A proposition was therefore made, in the Committee on Nominations, that I should be invited to become a candidate, and that if General Quitman should withdraw, my acceptance of the nomination and the resignation of my place in the United States Senate, which it was known would result, was to be followed by the appointment by the governor of General Quitman to the vacated place in the Senate. I offered no objection to this arrangement, but left it to General Quitman to decide. He claimed the nomination for the governorship or nothing, and was so nominated. To promote the success of the Democratic nominees, I engaged actively in the canvass, and continued in the field until stricken down by disease. This occurred just before the election of delegates to a state convention, for which provision had been made by the legislature, and the canvass for which, conducted in the main upon party lines, was in progress simultaneously with that for the ordinary state officers. The Democratic majority in the state, when the canvass began, was estimated at 8,000. At this election, in September, for delegates to the state convention, we were beaten by about 7,500 votes. Seeing in this result the foreshadowing of almost inevitable defeat, General Quitman withdrew from the canvass as a candidate, and the executive committee of the party, empowered to fill vacancies, called on me to take his place. My health did not permit me to leave home at that time, and only about 6 weeks remained before the election was to take place, but being assured that I was not expected to take any active part, and that the party asked only the use of my name, I consented to be announced, and immediately resigned from the United States Senate. Nevertheless, I soon afterward took the field in person, and worked earnestly until the day of election. I was defeated, but the majority of more than 7,000 votes that had been cast a short time before against the party with which I was associated was reduced to less than 1,000. Footnote 10. The following letter, written in 1853 to the Hon. William J. Brown of Indiana, formerly a member of Congress from that State, and subsequently published, relates to the events of this period, and affords nearly contemporaneous evidence in confirmation of the statements of the text. Washington, D.C., May 7th, 1853. My dear Sir, I received the Sentinel containing your defense of me against the late accusation of disunionism, and, before I had returned to you the thanks to which you are entitled, I received this day the St. Joseph Valley Register, marked by you, to call my attention to an article in answer to your defense, which was just in all things, save your too complimentary terms. I wish I had the letter quoted from, that you might publish the whole of that which is garbled, to answer a purpose. In a part of the letter not published, I put such a damper on the attempt to fix on me the desire to break up our union, and presented other points in a form so little acceptable to the unfriendly inquirers, that the publication of the letter had to be drawn out of them. At the risk of being wearisome, but encouraged by your marked friendship, I will give you a statement in the case. The meeting of October, 1849, was a convention of delegates equally representing the Whig and Democratic parties in Mississippi. The resolutions were decisive as to equality of right in the South with the North to the territories acquired from Mexico, and proposed a convention of the Southern States. I was not a member, but on invitation addressed the convention. The succeeding legislature instructed me, as a senator, to assert this equality, and, under the existing circumstances, to resist by all constitutional means the admission of California as a State. At a called session of the legislature in 1850, a self-constituted committee called on me by letter for my views. They were men who had enacted or approved the resolutions of the convention of 1849, and instructed me, as members of the legislature in regular session, in the early part of the year 1850. To them I replied that I adhered to the policy they had indicated, and instructed me in their official character to pursue. I pointed out the mode in which their policy could, in my opinion, be executed without bloodshed or disastrous convulsion, but in terms of bitter scorn alluded to such as would insult me with a desire to destroy the Union, for which my whole life proved me to be a devotee. Pardon the egotism, in consideration of the occasion, when I say to you that my father and my uncles fought through the Revolution of 1776, giving their youth, their blood, and their little patrimony to the constitutional freedom which I claim as my inheritance. 3 of my brothers fought in the War of 1812. 2 of them were comrades of the hero of the Hermitage, and received his commendation for gallantry at New Orleans. At 16 years of age I was given to the service of my country. For 12 years of my life I have borne its arms and served it zealously, if not well, as I feel the infirmities which suffering more than age has brought upon me. It would be a bitter reflection indeed if I was forced to conclude that my countrymen would hold all this light when weighed against the empty panegyric which a time-serving politician can bestow upon the Union, for which he never made a sacrifice. In the Senate I announced that, if any respectable man would call me a disunionist, I would answer him in monosyllables, but I have often asserted the right, for which the battles of the Revolution were fought, the right of the people to change their government whenever it was found to be oppressive and subversive of the objects for which governments are instituted, and have contended for the independence and sovereignty of the States, a part of the creed of which Jefferson was the apostle, Madison the expounder, and Jackson the consistent defender. I have written freely, and more than I designed. Accept my thanks for your friendly advocacy. Present me in terms of kind remembrance to your family, and believe me very sincerely yours, Jefferson Davis. Note: no party in Mississippi ever advocated disunion. They differed as to the mode of securing their rights in the Union, and on the power of a State to secede, neither advocating the exercise of the power. J.D. End of footnote. In this canvass, both before and after I became a candidate, no argument or appeal of mine was directed against the perpetuation of the Union. Believing, however, that the signs of the time portended danger to the South from the usurpation by the general government of undelegated powers, I counseled that Mississippi should enter into the proposed meeting of the people of the Southern States, to consider what could and should be done to insure our future safety, frankly stating my conviction that, unless such action were taken then, sectional rivalry would engender greater evils in the future, and that if the controversy was postponed, the last opportunity for a peaceful solution would be lost. Then the issue would have to be settled by blood. End of chapter 3. Recording by Bill Moseley, Bernardo, Texas, USA. Four of The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Moseley. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Part 1, Chapter 4. The author enters the Cabinet. Administration of the War Department. Surveys for a Pacific Railway. Extension of the capital. New regiments organized. Colonel Samuel Cooper, Adjutant General. A bit of civil service reform. Re-election to the Senate. Continuity of the Pierce Cabinet. Character of Franklin Pierce. Happy in the peaceful pursuits of a planter, busily engaged in cares for servants, in the improvement of my land, in building, in rearing livestock, and the like occupations, the time passed pleasantly away until my retirement was interrupted by an invitation to take a place in the cabinet of Mr. Pierce, who had been elected to the presidency of the United States in November, 1852. Although warmly attached to Mr. Pierce personally, and entertaining the highest estimate of his character and political principles, private and personal reasons led me to decline the offer. This was followed by an invitation to attend the ceremony of his inauguration, which took place on the 4th of March, 1853. While in Washington on this visit, I was induced by public considerations to reconsider my determination and to accept the office of Secretary of War. The public records of that period will best show how the duties of that office were performed. While in the Senate, I had advocated the construction of a railway to connect the valley of the Mississippi with the Pacific coast, and when an appropriation was made to determine the most eligible route for that purpose, the Secretary of War was charged with its application. We had then but little of that minute and accurate knowledge of the interior of the continent which was requisite for a determination of the problem. Several different parties were therefore organized to examine the various routes supposed to be practicable within the northern and southern limits of the United States. The arguments which I had used as a senator were the military necessity for such means of transportation, and the need of safe and rapid communication with the Pacific slope to secure its continuance as a part of the Union. In the organization and equipment of these parties, and in the selection of their officers, care was taken to provide for securing full and accurate information upon every point involved in the determination of the route. The only discrimination made was in the more prompt and thorough equipment of the parties for the extreme northern line, and this was only because that was supposed to be the most difficult of execution of all the surveys. In like manner, my advocacy while in the Senate of an extension of the Capitol, by the construction of a new Senate Chamber and Hall of Representatives, may have caused the appropriation for that object to be put under my charge as Secretary of War. During my administration of the War Department, material changes were made in the models of arms. Iron gun carriages were introduced, and experiments were made which led to the casting of heavy guns hollow instead of boring them after casting. Inquiries were made with regard to gunpowder, which subsequently led to the use of a coarser grain for artillery. During the same period, the army was increased by the addition of 2 regiments of infantry and 2 of cavalry. The officers of these regiments were chosen partly by selection from those already in service in the regular army, and partly by appointment from civil life. In making the selections from the army, I was continually indebted to the assistance of that pure-minded and accurately informed officer, Colonel Samuel Cooper, the Adjutant General, of whom it may be proper here to say that, although his life had been spent in the army, and he, of course, had the likes and dislikes inseparable from men who are brought into close contact and occasional rivalry, I never found in his official recommendations any indication of partiality or prejudice toward any one. When the first list was made out to be submitted to the President, a difficulty was found to exist, which had not occurred either to Colonel Cooper or myself. This was, that the officers selected purely on their military record did not constitute a roster conforming to that distribution among the different States, which, for political considerations, it was thought desirable to observe. That is to say, the number of such officers of Southern birth was found to be disproportionately great. Under instructions from the President, the list was therefore revised and modified in accordance with this new element of geographical distribution. This, as I am happy to remember, was the only occasion in which the current of my official action while Secretary of War was disturbed in any way by sectional or political considerations. Under former administrations of the War Office, it had not been customary to make removals or appointments upon political grounds, except in the case of clerkships. To this usage I not only adhered, but extended it to include the clerkships also. The chief clerk, who had been removed by my predecessor, had peculiar qualifications for the place, and although known to me only officially, he was restored to the position. It will probably be conceded by all who are well informed on the subject that his restoration was a benefit to the public service. Footnote 11. Soon after my entrance upon duty as Secretary of War, General Jessup, the Quartermaster General, presented to me a list of names from which to make selection of a clerk for his department. Observing that he had attached certain figures to these names, I asked whether the figures were intended to indicate the relative qualifications or preference in his estimation of the several applicants, and upon his answer in the affirmative, without further question, authorized him to appoint number 1 of his list. A day or two afterward, certain Democratic members of Congress called on me and politely inquired whether it was true that I had appointed a Whig to a position in the War Office. "Certainly not," I answered. "We thought you were not aware of it," said they, and proceeded to inform me that Mr. , the recent appointee to the clerkship just mentioned, was a Whig. After listening patiently to this statement, I answered that it was they who were deceived, not I. I had appointed a clerk. He had been appointed neither as a Whig nor as a Democrat, but merely as the fittest candidate for the place in the estimation of the chief of the bureau to which it belonged. I further gave them to understand that the same principle of selection would be followed in similar cases, so far as my authority extended. After some further discussion of the question, the visitors withdrew, dissatisfied with the result of the interview. The quartermaster general, on hearing of this conversation, hastened to inform me that it was all a mistake, that the appointee to the office had been confounded with his father, who was a well-known Whig, but that he, the son, was a Democrat. I assured the general that this was altogether immaterial, adding that it was a very pretty quarrel as it stood, and that I had no desire to effect a settlement of it on any inferior issue. Thenceforward, however, I was but little troubled with any pressure for political appointments in the department. The reader desirous for further information relative to the administration of the War Department during this period may find it in the various official reports and estimates of works of defense prosecuted or recommended, arsenals of construction and depots of arms maintained or suggested, and foundries employed during the presidency of Mr. Pierce, 1853 57. Having been again elected by the legislature of Mississippi as Senator to the United States, I passed from the cabinet of Mr. Pierce on the last day of his term, March 4th, 1857, to take my seat in the Senate. The administration of Franklin Pierce presents the only instance in our history of the continuance of the cabinet for 4 years without a single change in its personnel. When it is remembered that there was much dissimilarity, if not incongruity of character, among the members of that cabinet, some idea may be formed of the power over men possessed and exercised by Mr. Pierce. Chivalrous, generous, amiable, true to his friends and to his faith, frank and bold in the declaration of his opinions, he never deceived any one. And if treachery had ever come near him, it would have stood abashed in the presence of his truth, his manliness, and his confiding simplicity. End of chapter 4. Recording by Bill Moseley, Bernardo, Texas, USA. 5 of The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Moseley. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis. Volume 1A, Part 1, Chapter 5. The Territorial Question. An Incident at the White House. The Kansas and Nebraska Bill. The Missouri Compromise abrogated in 1850, not in 1854. Origin of squatter sovereignty. Sectional rivalry and its consequences. The Emigrant Aid Societies. The Bible and Sharp's Rifles. False pretensions as to principle. The Strife in Kansas. A Retrospect. The Original Equilibrium of Power and its Overthrow. Usurpations of the Federal Government. The Protective Tariff. Origin and Progress of Abolitionism. Who were the Friends of the Union? An Illustration of Political Morality. The organization of the Territory of Kansas was the first question that gave rise to exciting debate after my return to the Senate. The celebrated Kansas-Nebraska bill had become a law during the administration of Mr. Pierce. As this occupies a large space in the political history of the period, it is proper to state some facts connected with it, which were not public, but were known to me and to others yet living. The declaration, often repeated in 1850, that climate and the will of the people concerned should determine their institutions when they should form a constitution, and as a state be admitted into the Union, and that no legislation by Congress should be permitted to interfere with the free exercise of that will when so expressed, was but the announcement of the fact so firmly established in the Constitution that sovereignty resided alone in the states, and that Congress had only delegated powers. It has been sometimes contended that, because the Congress of the Confederation, by the ordinance of 1787, prohibited involuntary servitude in all the Northwestern Territory, the framers of the Constitution must have recognized such power to exist in the Congress of the United States. Hence the deduction that the prohibitory clause of what is known as the Missouri Compromise was justified by the precedent of the ordinance of 1787. To make the action of the Congress of the Confederation a precedent for the Congress of the United States is to overlook the great distinction between the two. The Congress of the Confederation represented the states in their sovereignty, and as such representatives had legislative, executive, and in some degree judicial power confided to it. Virtually it was an assemblage of the states. In certain cases a majority of 9 states were required to decide a question, but there was no express limitation or restriction, such as is to be found in the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States. The general government of the Union is composed of 3 departments, of which the Congress is the legislative branch, and which is checked by the revisory power of the judiciary and the veto power of the executive, and above all is expressly limited in legislation to powers expressly delegated by the states. If then it be admitted, which is certainly questionable, that the Congress of the Confederation had power to exclude slave property northwest of the Ohio River, that power must have been derived from its character as representing the states in their sovereignty, for no indication of such a power is to be found in the Articles of Confederation. If it be assumed that the absence of a prohibition was equivalent to the admission of the power in the Congress of the Confederation, the assumption would avail nothing in the Congress under the Constitution, where power is expressly limited to what had been delegated. More briefly, it may be stated that the Congress of the Confederation could, like the legislature of a state, do what had not been prohibited, but the Congress of the United States could only do what had been expressly permitted. It is submitted whether this last position is not conclusive against the possession of power by the United States Congress to legislate slavery into or exclude it from territories belonging to the United States. This subject, which had for more than a quarter of a century been one of angry discussion and sectional strife, was revived and found occasion for renewed discussion in the organization of territorial governments for Kansas and Nebraska. The Committees on Territories of the two houses agreed to report a bill in accordance with that recognized principle, provided they could first be assured that it would receive favorable consideration from the President. This agreement was made on Saturday, and the ensuing Monday was the day, and the only day for 2 weeks, on which, according to the order of business established by the rules of the House of Representatives, the bill could be introduced by the committee of that House. On Sunday morning, the 22nd of January, 1854, gentlemen of each committee called at my house, and Mr. Douglas, chairman of the Senate Committee, fully explained the proposed bill, and stated their purpose to be, through my aid, to obtain an interview on that day with the President, to ascertain whether the bill would meet his approbation. The President was known to be rigidly opposed to the reception of visits on Sunday for the discussion of any political subject. But in this case it was urged as necessary, in order to enable the committee to make their report the next day. I went with them to the Executive Mansion, and, leaving them in the reception room, sought the President in his private apartments, and explained to him the occasion of the visit. He thereupon met the gentlemen, patiently listened to the reading of the bill and their explanations of it, decided that it rested upon sound constitutional principles, and recognized in it only a return to that rule which had been infringed by the Compromise of 1820, and the restoration of which had been foreshadowed by the legislation of 1850. This bill was not, therefore, as has been improperly asserted, a measure inspired by Mr. Pierce or any of his cabinet, nor was it the first step taken toward the repeal of the conditions or obligations expressed or implied by the establishment in 1820 of the politico-sectional line of 36 degrees and 30 minutes. That compact had been virtually abrogated in 1850 by the refusal of the representatives of the North to apply it to the territory then recently acquired from Mexico. In May, 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Bill was passed. Its purpose was declared in the bill itself to be to carry into practical operation the propositions and principles established by the compromise measures of 1850. The Missouri Compromise, therefore, was not repealed by that bill. Its virtual repeal by the legislation of 1850 was recognized as an existing fact, and it was declared to be inoperative and void. It was added that the true intent and meaning of the act was not to legislate slavery into any territory or state, nor to exclude it therefrom, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way, subject only to the Constitution of the United States. From the terms of this bill, as well as from the arguments that were used in its behalf, it is evident that its purpose was to leave the territories equally open to the people of all the States, with every species of property recognized by any of them, to permit climate and soil to determine the current of immigration, and to secure to the people themselves the right to form their own institutions according to their own will, as soon as they should acquire the right of self-government; that is to say, as soon as their numbers should entitle them to organize themselves into a state, prepared to take its place as an equal sovereign member of the Federal Union. The claim, afterward advanced by Mr. Douglas and others, that this declaration was intended to assert the right of the first settlers of a territory in its inchoate, rudimental, dependent, and transitional condition, to determine the character of its institutions, constituted the doctrine popularly known as squatter sovereignty. Its assertion led to the dissensions which ultimately resulted in a rupture of the Democratic Party. Sectional rivalry, the deadly foe of the domestic tranquillity and the general welfare, which the compact of union was formed to insure, now interfered with gigantic efforts to prevent that free migration which had been promised, and to hinder the decision by climate and the interests of the inhabitants of the institutions to be established by these embryo states. Societies were formed in the North to supply money and send immigrants into the new territories, and a famous preacher, addressing a body of those immigrants, charged them to carry with them to Kansas the Bible and Sharp's rifles. The latter, of course, were to be leveled against the bosoms of their Southern brethren who might migrate to the same territory. But the use to be made of the Bible in the same fraternal enterprise was left unexplained by the reverend gentleman. The war cry employed to train the Northern mind for the deeds contemplated by the agitators was, "No extension of slavery." Was this sentiment real or feigned? The number of slaves, as has already been clearly shown, would not have been increased by their transportation to new territory. It could not be augmented by further importation, for the law of the land made that piracy. Southern men were the leading authors of that enactment, and the public opinion of their descendants, stronger than the law, fully sustained it. The climate of Kansas and Nebraska was altogether unsuited to the Negro, and the soil was not adapted to those productions for which Negro labor could be profitably employed. If, then, any Negroes, held to service or labor as provided in the compact of union, had been transported to those territories, they would have been such as were bound by a personal attachment mutually existing between master and servant, which would have rendered it impossible for the former to consider the latter as property convertible into money. As white laborers, adapted to the climate and its products, flowed into the country, Negro labor would have inevitably become a tax to those who held it, and their emancipation would have followed that condition, as it has in all the Northern states, old or new, Wisconsin furnishing the last example. Footnote 12: Extract from a speech of Mr. Davis, of Mississippi, in the Senate of the United States, May 17, 1860. "There is a relation belonging to this species of property, unlike that of the apprentice or the hired man, which awakens whatever there is of kindness or of nobility of soul in the heart of him who owns it. This can only be alienated, obscured, or destroyed by collecting this species of property into such masses that the owner is not personally acquainted with the individuals who compose it. In the relation, however, which can exist in the Northwestern Territories, the mere domestic connection of one, two, or at most half a dozen servants in a family, associating with the children as they grow up, attending upon age as it declines, there can be nothing against which either philanthropy or humanity can make an appeal. Not even the emancipationist could raise his voice, for this is the high road and the open gate to the condition in which the masters would, from interest, in a few years, desire the emancipation of every one who may thus be taken to the Northwestern frontier." It may therefore be reasonably concluded that the war cry was employed by the artful to inflame the minds of the less informed and less discerning. That it was adopted in utter disregard of the means by which negro emancipation might have been peaceably accomplished in the territories, and with the sole object of obtaining sectional control and personal promotion by means of popular agitation. The success attending this artifice was remarkable. To such an extent was it made available that Northern indignation was aroused on the absurd accusation that the South had destroyed that sacred instrument, the Compromise of 1820. The internecine war which raged in Kansas for several years was substituted for the promised peace under the operation of the natural laws regulating migration to new territories. For the fratricide which dyed the virgin soil of Kansas with the blood of those who should have stood shoulder to shoulder in subduing the wilderness, for the frauds which corrupted the ballot box and made the name of election a misnomer, let the authors of squatter sovereignty and the fomenters of sectional hatred answer to the posterity for whose peace and happiness the fathers formed the federal compact. In these scenes of strife were trained the incendiaries who afterward invaded Virginia under the leadership of John Brown, and at this time germinated the sentiments which led men of high position to sustain, with their influence and their money, this murderous incursion into the South. Now was seen the lightning of that storm, the distant muttering of which had been heard so long, and against which the wise and the patriotic had given solemn warning, regarding it as the sign which portended a dissolution of the Union. Diversity of interests and of opinions among the states of the Confederation had in the beginning presented great difficulties in the way of the formation of a more perfect union. The compact was the result of compromise between the states, at that time generally distinguished as navigating and agricultural, afterward as Northern and Southern. When the first census was taken in 1790, there was but little numerical difference in the population of those two sections, and including states about to be admitted, there was also an exact equality in the number of states. Each section had, therefore, the power of self-protection, and might feel secure against any danger of federal aggression. If the disturbance of that equilibrium had been the consequence of natural causes, and the government of the whole had continued to be administered strictly for the general welfare, there would have been no ground for complaint of the result. Under the old Confederation, the Southern states had a large excess of territory. The acquisition of Louisiana, of Florida, and of Texas afterward greatly increased this excess. The generosity and patriotism of Virginia led her, before the adoption of the Constitution, to cede the Northwest Territory to the United States. The Missouri Compromise surrendered to the North all the newly acquired region not included in the State of Missouri, and north of the parallel of 36 degrees and a half. The northern part of Texas was in like manner given up by the Compromise of 1850, and the North, having obtained by those successive cessions a majority in both houses of Congress, took to itself all the territory acquired from Mexico. Thus, by the action of the general government, the means were provided permanently to destroy the original equilibrium between the sections. Nor was this the only injury to which the South was subjected. Under the power of Congress to levy duties on imports, tariff laws were enacted, not merely to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, as authorized by the Constitution, but positively and primarily for the protection against foreign competition of domestic manufactures. The effect of this was to impose the main burden of taxation upon the Southern people, who were consumers and not manufacturers, not only by the enhanced price of imports, but indirectly by the consequent depreciation in the value of exports, which were chiefly the products of Southern states. The imposition of this grievance was unaccompanied by the consolation of knowing that the tax thus borne was to be paid into the public treasury, for the increase of price accrued mainly to the benefit of the manufacturer. Nor was this all. A reference to the annual appropriations will show that the disbursements made were as unequal as the burdens borne, the inequality in both operating in the same direction. These causes all combined to direct immigration to the northern section, and with the increase of its preponderance appeared more and more distinctly a tendency in the federal government to pervert functions delegated to it and to use them with sectional discrimination against the minority. The resistance to the admission of Missouri as a state in 1820 was evidently not owing to any moral or constitutional considerations, but merely to political motives, and the compensation exacted for granting what was simply a right was the exclusion of the South from equality in the enjoyment of territory which justly belonged equally to both, and which was what the enemies of the South stigmatized as slave territory when acquired. The sectional policy then indicated brought to its support the passions that spring from man's higher nature, but which, like all passions, if misdirected and perverted, become hurtful, and it may be destructive. The year 1835 was marked by the public agitation for the abolition of that African servitude which existed in the South, which antedated the Union and had existed in every one of the states that formed the Confederation. By a great misconception of the powers belonging to the general government and the responsibilities of citizens of the northern states, many of those citizens were, little by little, brought to the conclusion that slavery was a sin for which they were answerable, and that it was the duty of the federal government to abate it. Though at the date above referred to, numerically so weak, when compared with either of the political parties at the North, as to excite no apprehension of their power for evil, the public demonstrations of the abolitionists were violently rebuked generally at the North. The party was contemned on account of the character of its leaders, and the more odious because chief among them was an Englishman, one Thompson, who was supposed to be an emissary, whose mission was to prepare the way for a dissolution of the Union. Let us hope that it was reverence for the obligations of the Constitution as the soul of the Union that suggested lurking danger, and rendered the supposed emissary for its destruction so odious that he was driven from a Massachusetts hall where he attempted to lecture. But bodies in motion will overcome bodies at rest, and the unreflecting too often are led by captivating names, far from the principles they revere. Thus, by the activity of the propagandists of abolitionism, and the misuse of the sacred word liberty, they recruited from the ardent worshippers of that goddess such numbers as gave them in many northern states the balance of power between the two great political forces that stood arrayed against each other. Then and there they came to be courted by both of the great parties, especially by the Whigs, who had become the weaker party of the two. Fanaticism, to which is usually accorded sincerity as an extension of its mischievous tenets, affords the best excuse to be offered for the original abolitionists. But that cannot be conceded to the political associates who joined them for the purpose of acquiring power. With them it was but hypocritical cant, intended to deceive. Hence arose the declaration of the existence of an irrepressible conflict, because of the domestic institutions of sovereign, self-governing states, institutions over which neither the federal government nor the people outside the limits of such states had any control, and for which they could have no moral or legal responsibility. Those who are to come after us, and who will look without prejudice or excitement at the record of events which have occurred in our day, will not fail to wonder how men professing and proclaiming such a belief should have so far imposed upon the credulity of the world as to be able to arrogate to themselves the claim of being the special friends of a union contracted in order to insure domestic tranquillity among the people of the States united; that they were the advocates of peace, of law, and of order, who, when taking an oath to support and maintain the Constitution, did so with a mental reservation to violate one of the provisions of that Constitution, one of the conditions of the compact, without which the Union could never have been formed. The tone of political morality which could make this possible was well indicated by the toleration accorded in the Senate to the flippant, inconsequential excuse for it given by one of its most eminent exemplars. "Is thy servant a dog that he should do this thing?" meaning thereby, not that it would be the part of a dog to violate his oath, but to keep it in the matter referred to. See Appendix D. End of chapter 5. Recording by Bill Moseley, Llano County, Texas, USA.